welcome back to our last little series here that we're going to do on mixing. Now that we've collected all these tracks, guitar, bass, drums, now you got a whole slew of tracks and we've got to figure out what to do and how to organize them together. Number one thing that I've mentioned in the first video series is to be able to be organized with where your tracks are going, okay? So files management is going to be a common word that you're going to hear. When our interns are here, we usually press how important it is to be able to understand when you start tracking a session as to where those tracks are actually going to reside, okay? Also, as I mentioned, we have a cumulative amount of tracks here, and that's the key. The key is how each track will work with each other, tonality-wise. Okay, and that's the key. I like to use the word tonality balance. All right, so when I mix, I don't necessarily mix in terms of just raising the kick drum, lowering the bass guitar. I usually concentrate on how the tonal balances are instead of just the obvious. Okay, so we're going to start with our drums. We're going to start with our kick drum, and then we're going to listen to the tonality of the kick drum itself. A lot of times, what I'll do is I'll actually just listen to the overall mix before I even get into any kind of EQing or any kind of processing whatsoever. And I'll actually just get a balance going first. And then what I'll do is I'll start working backwards. I'll start taking out some of the frequencies that I think are conflicting as it relates from instrument to instrument. At this point in time, I refer to this as a big hunk of clay. And basically what you want to be able to do is start sculpturing your clay to get it to be focused into some kind of artwork of some sort, okay? So, and the key to it is to understand how detailed you're going to get with your art. In other words, how clear do you want your mixes to actually be? And I'm guilty of making my mixes sound crystal clean. And lately, that's a style, in my humble opinion, that's a style that an engineer will actually take. And what happens in a situation like that is it allows those reverb tails to actually be nice and clear. A lot of times we'll get musicians that say, hey, I need a little bit more reverb on my voice. And when that happens, a lot of times I have to listen to it and decipher whether there's so much real estate taken up by all the other instruments that the tail of the reverb doesn't get cut off. A lot of times I'll think about this big hunk of clay, I'll start chewing it up. I don't use any reverb, by the way, when I do any of my mixes to begin with. The only time I use reverb is if I want to color an instrument or color a voice. So I'll take a different approach in terms of the philosophy of using reverb. It's not uncommon that if the voice sounds relatively thin, I have to think about how can I make that voice take on a little bit more color. And reverb's a perfect tool to do that with. Okay, so we're going to actually start with the drums. Kick, snare, sometimes snare bottom, overheads, hi-hat, toms 1 and 2 and 3, and then room. Okay, now, one thing to understand, as I was saying earlier, that is the room makes a big difference when you start utilizing compressors. Okay, now I know a lot of people like to put compressors on everything. The problem is that once you start going down that path where you put one compressor on one instrument, it almost forces you to start putting compressors on all the instruments, because what you're doing is you're minimizing the dynamics. Okay, and a lot of times, depending on the musician, of course, the musician will perform based on what they're hearing. So if you're tracking with compressors, what you're doing is you're actually taking away the dynamics and how they respond to the other instrumentalist, okay, in the band. So it's critical that you be careful about utilizing compressors during the tracking session. And as I said in one of the previous videos, that the only time I use a compressor is if I want to help control a little bit of going over. I need to get a little bit more volume out of that musician. If the musician's not very good in terms of the control of the instrument, a lot of times I end up using a compressor to help counteract that problem. But it is a double-edged sword, because you do have musicians that come in that want to respond to the musicians around them, and they do it dynamically. So you want to be careful not to take that away from them. When it comes to mixing, however, at the end of the day, a lot of people like to get volume out of their mixes. So what happens is you end up having to compress your instruments, or you're going to end up riding gains all over the place. So I still ride gain a little bit, but you'll end up using compression on basically almost all the instruments. And I find myself trying not to do that, but it's a double-edged sword. As soon as you start putting a compressor on the guitar, you put one on the bass. Before you know it, you got to get one on the vocalist, because you're minimizing those dynamics And as you do it per instrument, you find the instruments that don't have compression on it, they start to stick out in your mixes. I'm going to talk a little bit about the EQ side of things right now. There is a chart that you can get your hands on, and it's an EQ chart. It's a frequency chart, and if you get online, you can research frequency charts. And what's awesome about this is it actually shows you the overlapping of the instruments. Now, overlapping is critical when you start to utilize an EQ, because once you start chewing up, let's say, the bass guitar, and you do a roll off on the very bottom end, now it limits to some degree some of that real estate. You may want to use some of that real estate, but you might want to share it with, let's say, the kick drum. Okay, so where you roll off is critical on the perception of the bottom end of your mix. Okay, now obviously you're not going to hear the very low frequencies, but you can feel them, and you can get a sense that the mixes can be very big sounding, depending on how high you roll off your low end. A lot of times I like to get a handle on how the bass and the kick drum are going to function together and try to share some real estate there. But keep in mind also that not only the bass guitar, the kick drum, your toms, the low end of your vocal track, depending on the key that the singer's singing in, the male voice obviously is going to generate a little bit more low mids. If you just roll everything off, you're actually shortchanging your mix a little bit. You want to be very selective in the low end. Okay, so in other words, you got your kick drum that's going to occupy maybe some of your very low frequencies to some degree. Maybe the bass guitar is going to chew up some of that real estate, and you want those two to share some of that area. But then also your guitar, maybe the keyboard. So an EQ is going to be a very useful tool to help get those frequencies sound more balanced in the bottom end of your mixes. Okay, great chart again. If you get online, you can research it out. Frequency chart. And that'll help you understand where these instruments reside. Okay, now again, the keys have an awful lot to do with where you decide you're gonna take a dip with your EQs, okay? And I've had questions of, do you like to use subtractive EQ versus additive EQ? I'm more of a subtractive EQ kind of guy. I like to first start out with this big hunk of clay. It's got all these frequencies in it. Then I actually take away the frequencies that seem to be overlapping other instruments and get them so that there's some clarity between each instrument. Okay, so I like to use subtractive EQ in that sense. Kick drum, yes, I do roll-offs with the kick drum. Depending on the music, I wait to hear what the music's going to sound like. So again, if you're tracking with roll-offs, right off the bat, you're chopping off some information down at the bottom end. I try not to do that. I try to save that for the mix, because who knows, maybe you want to utilize some of that let's say in a bridge section of a song. You want the very bottom end of the kick drum to come up. You can automate, so just in the bridge you've got more low end, and then when the verses or the choruses come back in, you can actually change the roll-off point through automation. But generally speaking, your EQ is definitely going to be a tool that you're going to have to learn how to use. Now, as far as like compression goes, especially like on drums, you got to be careful, because a lot of times the compressor will actually change the tonality specifically with your kick drum and snare drum. And I know a lot of people like to use compressors on a kick drum and snare drum because they feel that they need to have consistency, which is true, but depending on the style of music. You get a jazz cat in here, a lot of times the jazz guys like to have these dynamic swings with the kick drum, snare drum. You get a drummer that plays with soft notes, we call those grace notes or ghost strokes. You don't want to minimize those. You want to be able to hear those, yes, but you also want to be able to hear the accented parts as well. So you want to be careful how much compression you use on a drum. I don't use much compression on drums, believe it or not. The only time that I would do it is if I create a drum bus, and then I'll utilize, just generally speaking, a general compression on the main drum bus itself. I guess the only other time that I would use compression would be on the overheads. A lot of times I'll get a drummer who is very aggressive, and what happens is your overheads obviously end up picking up a lot of the snares. So what I like to do is concentrate on just getting the overheads to grab just the cymbals. So I'll use a compressor. I'll usually set the attack relatively fast and the release relatively quick. And what happens is on all the tune 4s, that'll actually pull the snare drum down into the cymbal, so you're mainly getting just the cymbal wash itself and not so much the crack of the snare drum. And then the channel that you're using to amplify your snare drum, you can bring that up and still maintain the integrity of the tonal sound of that snare drum. Again, I like to try to get all the drums to sound good together, the tonal balances of them. Then I'll add the bass guitar in, I'll get the bass to sound tonally balanced with the drums. And then I'll start adding the guitar instruments in, and then I'll start adding keyboards, depending on the music, and then of course the vocal track. Now, one thing I didn't talk about was prioritizing your mix. I like to think about what is the most important ingredient of a mix, and in most cases it's the melody. I'll give that person the real estate. I'll let that person chew up as much real estate as possible, make that person sound nice and rich, nice and full, nice and convincing. And then that's going to force you to take dips out of the other instruments. So you're giving plenty of real estate for the vocalist. It's not uncommon, as I said earlier, that if you get a vocalist that sounds relatively thin, there's going to be two reasons behind that. One, either the voice just doesn't have a good quality sound to it, the key that the voice is in, or sometimes it's because you're chewing up so much real estate with all the other instruments that the voice just naturally sounds thin because you've got all this real estate being hogged up with the kick, the snare, the toms, the guitar, and it's not uncommon that the voice takes back seat. So that's why I like to say prioritize your mixes, concentrate on the lead voice or the melody line, get that instrument to sound nice and rich and full, and work all the instruments around it. I think that's pretty much about it. And again, this is all an opinion. That's how I like to approach my mixes. Tonal balance, and that's the key. Tonality balance.